Life in medieval England was far from the romantic ballads. The average person was neither a knight in shining armor nor a noble lady in silk. Their world was one of earth, sweat, and, more often than not, hardship. Their idea of comfort ended where the first cold night began. Dreams of wealth were as distant as the moon from the king's castle. From birth, their lives were determined by the circumstances in which they found themselves. A person born into poverty had very little chance of escaping this cycle, and war was not a glorious feat for them, but just another job. And this job promised neither wealth nor honor. It was fraught with daily hardships and risks that people today prefer not to remember. Their reality was harsh and unforgiving, where mistakes were paid for not with money, but with their lives. They could make mistakes all the time, and no one was watching over them or backing them up. Unlike modern soldiers, their fate was not predetermined and could end at any moment. Watch until the end to understand why ordinary people rarely return from war the same as they left. When conscription was announced in medieval England, it was not a heroic call to arms with trumpets and drums. Rather, it was a dry, emotionless process, devoid of any pathos. People treated it as an inevitable duty rather than a great feat. They felt no enthusiasm, but rather fear and anxiety for their fate. In their eyes, war was not glory, but hard and dangerous work. Most often, it was very similar to recruiting workers for hard and dangerous jobs, akin to today's recruitment for construction work in a distant country. People were attracted by promises of earnings, albeit modest. They understood that they were taking a big risk, but they had no choice. For many, it was their only chance to earn any money at all. It was not just a financial decision, but a matter of survival. A peasant who was barely making ends meet saw military service as a way to save his family from starvation. Recruiters often painted a rosy picture, promising generous spoils and easy campaigns, but the reality was much harsher. Soldiers left their homes and fields to face certain death or injury, knowing that if they died, their families would be left without a breadwinner. This fear and uncertainty were constant companions of the medieval soldier. The king or lord could not simply order people to go to war at will. His power was limited by tradition and law. The feudal system did not give him complete freedom of action, and he could not take people's land and livestock away from them. His orders had to be lawful and justified. There were very strict rules known as feudal obligations, which regulated the entire process. These obligations were a kind of constitution of the time. They clearly defined who had to serve, how much, and for how long. Thus, even the king was bound by these unwritten laws. The feudal system obliged vassals to perform military service in exchange for land holdings. It was not so much a choice as a duty prescribed in the feudal contract. The vassal received land for use, but in return had to provide soldiers for his suzerain's army. This contract was sacred, and its violation resulted in the loss of land. Breaking the contract was considered one of the most serious crimes, which could lead to the confiscation of all possessions and the loss of title. That is why lords took their obligations very seriously. For example, if a lord did not provide the required number of soldiers, he could be deprived of part of his land. It was a clear hierarchy in which everyone had their responsibilities. The king, in turn, was also limited, as he could not demand more from his vassals than was specified in the contract. This created a kind of balance of power, where rights and obligations were clearly divided. For example, a large landowner who owned many villages was obliged to supply the king with a certain number of soldiers for a certain period of time, usually 40 days a year. This was a kind of tax in blood. 40 days was enough time to conduct a short campaign or participate in a siege, but it was not enough for a long war. The feudal system was not perfect, but it gave the king the ability to quickly raise an army. This tax was fair, as each lord paid for his land. If the war dragged on, as it usually did, the lord had to pay his people to continue serving. This payment was called scutage, or shield money, and allowed the lord to hire professional soldiers instead of militiamen. These professional soldiers were better trained than the simple militia. They were more reliable and motivated. This system was beneficial to both sides, as the lord could avoid personal involvement in the campaign, and the king received better quality and more motivated mercenaries. Scutage was a very important tool for the king, as it allowed him to form a more reliable and professional army that was not dependent on feudal obligations. For example, The siege of a large city required long and painstaking work, and 40 days was clearly not enough. In such cases, the king could collect money from all his vassals who were unwilling or unable to participate in the campaign personally, and use this money to hire professional archers from Wales or infantrymen from Flanders. These mercenaries were well-trained and willing to serve for as long as they were paid, which made them much more reliable than militias. This system led to a very interesting and paradoxical situation that seems unthinkable today. A soldier, mercenary, or simply a militiaman who had served his 40 days could simply turn around and leave. And no one had the right to stop him because he had fulfilled his duty. Such behavior was dictated not by cowardice, but by harsh reality. The soldier understood perfectly well that his family and farm came first. His duty to his lord had been fulfilled, and he was returning to his responsibilities. This often led to the collapse of entire armies on the eve of a decisive battle. This created enormous logistical and tactical problems for the commanders. The battle could be scheduled for the 41st day, and half the troops would already have scattered to their homes, and the lord would have to gather a new unit from scratch, trying to keep at least some of them with promises and money. This was a huge risk as the new unit was poorly trained. But where could a simple soldier go when there was famine in the land? And why did he leave anyway? Imagine the scene. The army is standing before the walls of the enemy's castle. Victory is within reach, but the 40th day of service is already looming on the horizon. The commander, knowing that half of his troops will leave tomorrow, tries to persuade them to stay, promising them mountains of gold. But the peasant, remembering his unharvested field and hungry family, chooses to go home. This was not betrayal, but pragmatism. In such situations, the lords had to show miracles of diplomacy and generosity to keep their people from leaving. The fact was that his family and farm, consisting of a small plot of land, were on the verge of survival, and every 40 days spent on campaign were equivalent to the loss of the entire harvest, without which it was impossible to survive the winter. The unattended fields were overgrown with weeds, livestock could be lost, and his wife and children were left unprotected from raids by bandits. Service was not a heroic deed, but merely an extreme measure to earn at least something rather than starve to death on one's own land. In this regard, in order to keep people, the lords had to conclude individual contracts with warriors, which were called indentures. These were detailed documents that specified all the terms of service, pay, duration, and even possible bonuses if the campaign was successful. These contracts even specified such minor details as the type and quality of equipment to be provided by the lord. For example, there could be a clause stating that a warrior would receive a gambeson and a wooden shield, and if he brought his own sword, he would receive additional payment. This is why many mercenaries preferred to serve wealthy and influential lords. Their contracts were more reliable, and their payments were guaranteed. Against a backdrop of constant need, stability was the most valuable commodity. Do you think they had a real choice? Share your opinion in the comments. Modern films show us an army where all the soldiers are dressed in brand new, shiny armor, as if they had just come out of a blacksmith's forge. In reality, this was impossible. Equipment depended on status and wealth, and the difference between the equipment of a knight and a simple foot soldier was enormous. Knights who could afford it wore heavy armor that cost a fortune. Today, it would be comparable to the price of an expensive car. These were true works of art. A simple soldier had to make do with whatever he could get. Most often, this was a gambeson, a quilted jacket made of several layers of linen stuffed with tow or wool. It provided decent protection against blows, softening them, but was powerless against the sharp points of spears or arrows, which easily pierced it. It was a fragile and unreliable means of protection. Gambeson was the most common element of armor, as almost anyone could make it. It was relatively cheap and light, but its protective properties were minimal. For example, when struck by a sword, the gambeson could soften the blow, but it did not protect against broken bones. Against an arrow fired from an English longbow, it was completely useless. The arrow easily pierced it, inflicting a fatal wound. Chainmail provided much better protection, but it was much more expensive, and only wealthy warriors could afford it. Chainmail was a mesh of many steel rings that provided reliable protection against slashing blows, but were still vulnerable to sharp points. Shields could be made of wood covered with leather, and helmets were simple, similar to pots, which did not always cover the back of the head. These helmets, by the way, often caused serious injuries. For example, with a strong blow, it could hit the head, leaving a deep cut. Weapons also varied, but if you couldn't afford a sword, you took what you had. It could be a spear, an axe, or even a simple agricultural tool that had been converted for battle. Often, soldiers used their work tools, such as hammers or scythes, which they forged into weapons. Such equipment was extremely ineffective and often broke at the most crucial moment, leaving a person unprotected. Many of them went into battle knowing that their weapons could fail them and that their chances of survival depended on luck rather than the quality of their equipment. But what if this motley equipment wasn't the soldier's biggest problem? I wonder what will happen next. Keep watching. Helmets such as the kelpak or chapeau were simple and cheap, but did not provide adequate protection. For example, the chapeau was a simple metal cap with flaps that protected against blows from above, but left the face and neck exposed. With a strong blow, it could deform and injure the warrior himself. Weapons were also a problem. Swords were very expensive and were a symbol of knightly status. A simple foot soldier who could not afford a sword would take up a spear or an axe, which were much cheaper. Sometimes they would take whatever they could find on their farms, sickles, scythes, or even clubs studded with nails. These improvised weapons were unreliable and could break at the most inopportune moment, often leading to death. This motley and unreliable equipment created confusion on the battlefield and made the army vulnerable. But what if this motley equipment wasn't the soldier's biggest problem? I wonder what will happen next. Keep watching. Many people imagine the Middle Ages as an era where a man's word was his bond, and honesty and integrity were valued. However, the reality was much more complex and harsh. Concepts of honor and keeping one's word often took a back seat when it came to survival and debt. When a soldier finally received his long-awaited payment for his service, he could not always dispose of it as he saw fit. Very often, this money was immediately used to pay off debts to numerous creditors who stood behind him like shadows. It was an inevitable cycle from which it was almost impossible to escape. For example, a single campaign could generate dozens of debts for weapon repairs, new clothes, provisions purchased on credit. All these debts accumulated like a snowball and demanded immediate payment as soon as the soldier had any money. This situation was like a vicious circle from which there was no escape. Soldiers already had debts when they went to war, and these only grew during their service. For example, a broken shield or a dull sword had to be repaired by a blacksmith, who, not knowing whether the warrior would return from the war, took money in advance or demanded immediate payment upon his return. Often, in order to repair their armor, soldiers had to borrow money from loan sharks. This created a snowball effect. One debt led to another, and in the end, when the soldier received his pay, it immediately went to pay off these debts. These creditors could be different people. For example, moneylenders who lent money at exorbitant interest rates, taking advantage of the desperate situation of soldiers. Often, moneylenders were the only salvation when money was urgently needed. These could be local shopkeepers or merchants from whom soldiers bought provisions, tools, and other necessities, recording them in a debt book. These merchants often inflated prices, taking advantage of the lack of competition. Even one's own lord could act as a creditor. After all, armor, weapons, and equipment cost a fortune. Soldiers, especially new recruits, often could not afford to buy everything at once and were forced to borrow equipment, becoming even more dependent on their lord. In essence, they began their service already in debt, and every step they took increased their dependence. Therefore, many warriors who appeared wealthy were in fact poorer than their comrades. They had shiny armor and sharp weapons, but they did not truly own them, as they were mired in debt. In reality, their property belonged to their creditors. And after the end of the military campaign, their situation became even more dire. Left without a steady income, they struggled to make ends meet, trying to pay off their debts, which continued to grow. Without new campaigns and accordingly new earnings, they had no chance of getting out of debt. But what if a person did not want to go to war, but was still obliged to do so by military service or feudal obligation? Then he could hire a substitute. For money, of course. This was a very common way to avoid danger. This rule was enshrined in feudal law and was actively used by noble people. A rich man could simply pay someone else to go to war in his place. This revealed another social problem that clearly demonstrated the inequality of the time. The rich hired mercenaries, often experienced and well-equipped, to fight for them. These were true professionals in their field. The poor, who did not even have enough money to eat, went to war themselves in order to somehow feed their families. For them, military service was not a matter of honor, but a harsh necessity, a chance to survive in a merciless world. This created enormous social inequality. While a rich knight could sit at home minding his own business, his mercenary substitute risked his life on the battlefield for a modest fee. For example, if a lord had to provide 10 knights, he could hire 10 professional soldiers, paying them out of his own pocket, and thus avoid personal involvement in a dangerous campaign. This meant that it was mainly the poor who fought on the battlefields, while the rich either commanded or were absent altogether. The daily life of a soldier on campaign was incredibly hard and exhausting. Far from home, in harsh conditions, they had to give up basic amenities. They did not live in comfortable, warm tents with cozy fireplaces and soft beds. Their life was Spartan, devoid of any comfort. Often, they slept directly on the bare, cold ground, wrapped in their thin cloaks, and placed something hard under their heads if they were lucky enough to find a suitable stone or log. Real tents and beds were the privilege of commanders and nobility. They ate whatever they could find or get from their marching rations. The main diet of a soldier consisted of the simplest and most unpretentious foods. It was hard, stale bread that quickly went rancid, a piece of salted cheese that helped to get at least some protein, and dried meat, which was incredibly tough but kept for a long time. All this was washed down with water from the nearest sources, which were not always clean. This food was designed solely for survival, to keep soldiers from starving to death, not to give them an enjoyable meal or all the nutrients they needed. The quality of the food left much to be desired, and many soldiers suffered from various diseases due to poor nutrition and unsanitary conditions. Poor food and poor quality water were the cause of dysentery and other diseases that killed soldiers far more often than enemy swords. But what happened when there was not enough food? For example, due to bad weather conditions, enemy attacks on supply convoys, or simply poor organization? In such cases, real famine set in, which could lead to mass disease and a decline in the combat effectiveness of the entire army. Soldiers began to loot the local population to find anything edible. What happened to a soldier when he was seriously wounded in battle? And who helped him in these harsh conditions, far from doctors and cities? To find out the answers to these questions, stay tuned. The most interesting part is coming up. Combat wounds in those days were not just dangerous, they were deadly, even if they initially seemed minor. While today a person with a gunshot wound has a high chance of survival thanks to modern medical technology, skilled surgeons, and antibiotics, back then even a small cut from a jagged or rusty sword, arrow, or spear could be the beginning of a painful end. It was a harsh world where even the most superficial scratch could end in tragedy. The lack of basic knowledge about antiseptics, hygiene, and of course the absence of antibiotics made any open wound a potential death sentence. Infection was an invisible but far more formidable enemy than any warrior on the battlefield. Doctors at the time did not understand how diseases arose and were unable to effectively combat internal threats. At best, a wounded soldier was taken to a field barber. This was not a doctor in the modern sense of the word, but rather a craftsman who, in addition to cutting hair, shaving, and pulling teeth, could provide the most primitive and limited first aid. He had no medical training. His knowledge was superficial, passed down by word of mouth, and often consisted of a whole set of superstitions and ineffective practices. Barbers saw no difference between treatment and ritual. He might sew up a wound with coarse thread and a needle, then cauterize it with a red-hot iron to stop heavy bleeding. This procedure was unbearably painful and often led to even more serious tissue damage, while the infection continued to develop inside. Thus, the treatment itself could worsen the condition of the wounded. Sometimes simple, often dirty water was used to wash wounds, which could itself be a source of infection, as no one knew about microbes and bacteria. Thus, infections were the main threat to wounded soldiers. Often, it was not an enemy sword or arrow that finished them off, but slow, painful gangrene or sepsis. Soldiers could survive the bloodiest battle, endure all the hardships of combat and the barber surgeon's cruel methods, only to die a few days later from fever and blood poisoning. They had no escape from this invisible but deadly threat, and many of them died in agony, surrounded by their comrades who were powerless to do anything. These comrades could only watch as their fellow soldier slowly faded away from fever, unable to ease his suffering. In the end, even the strongest, most resilient, and experienced warriors could die from a wound that today would be considered minor and quickly healing, posing no serious threat to life. In those days, when life was so short and full of danger, people were incredibly superstitious. They believed in omens, spirits, mystical forces, and prophecies, trying to explain the inexplicable and gain at least some control over their destiny. Death was part of their everyday life, lurking at every turn, and fear was a constant companion, permeating their every step. Life in war was fragile, and they sought comfort and protection wherever they could. Before battle, soldiers would usually pray, turning to God, the Virgin Mary, patron saints, and their ancestors, asking for protection from death and serious injury. They wore crosses and amulets, believed in omens and rituals that were supposed to bring them luck and save them from death. For example, it was believed that certain words or actions could ward off enemy blows, or that certain talismans could make them invulnerable. They believed that higher powers could save them from certain death, and that prayer was their only shield. But in war, when life hangs in the balance, there are moments when even the strongest prayers cannot help, and one must act differently, relying on oneself and one's comrades. What happened when luck turned its back on the warriors? When their morale fell and their hope faded? For example, when the fire went out in the camp and no one had any firewood left? In the darkness and cold, far from home and under God's protection, soldiers became vulnerable not only to the enemy, but also to their own fears and instincts. What dark side of war were they forced to discover in these bleak moments? What terrible choices did they have to make in order to survive? The answer's coming soon. When an army was defeated, it did not simply retreat in an orderly fashion. The process very often descended into complete chaos and disorder, engulfing everyone involved in the battle. Soldiers who lost their commanders did not know what to do next and felt abandoned and doomed. In the absence of clear orders and unified leadership, they often lost all discipline and instinctively tried to save themselves at any cost. Imagine the scene. Thousands of soldiers who just moments ago were standing shoulder to shoulder suddenly turn into a disorderly, uncontrollable crowd, driven by the instinct of self-preservation. In their panic, they threw away their weapons, heavy armor, helmets, and shields, anything that prevented them from quickly fleeing the battlefield. The commanders who had commanded these men just moments before found themselves powerless to stop the wave of panic. Often they simply scattered into the surrounding area, trying to find shelter in the forests, swamps, or nearest villages and avoid pursuit. The roads were clogged with fleeing soldiers, carts loaded with supplies and wagons, which they simply abandoned, creating even greater chaos. The confusion intensified when panic set in, and everyone tried to escape on their own. Soldiers trying to break through the crowd could injure or trample their own comrades. The roads, which had recently been traveled by a combat-ready army, were turned into ruins, littered with abandoned property, broken carts, spilled provisions, and corpses. Abandoned equipment, food, and supplies became targets of looting not only for the victors, but also for local residents who, like vultures, quickly flooded the battlefield in search of any spoils. The disorganization and chaos of the retreating troops were so great that sometimes victory turned into a real bloodbath. Commanders lost control of their soldiers, who began to loot and kill indiscriminately, making no distinction between armed enemies and civilians. Often, even those who were not wounded, but simply running away to save themselves, were killed. Entire villages that happened to be in the path of the retreating army could be burned to the ground and their inhabitants killed. This was not so much military action as a manifestation of the savagery and cruelty that had engulfed everyone. It was the perfect time for looting, which took on unprecedented proportions. The victors, intoxicated by their success, robbed not only the dead, but also the living, the wounded, and the prisoners. They took everything that could be of any value: weapons, armor, clothing, jewelry, coins. All of this was considered legitimate spoils of war, and no one could condemn them for it. Moreover, commanders often turned a blind eye to such behavior, as it served as a kind of reward for the soldiers, raising their morale. But that was not the end of it. In this chaos, even ordinary soldiers had no rights. They could be robbed by their own comrades who took advantage of the general confusion to enrich themselves. Cases where one soldier took trophies or even food from another were commonplace. Often this was not only due to greed, but also to a desperate desire to survive in conditions where food and water supplies had been lost. Thus, on the battlefield, one could die not only at the hands of the enemy, but also at the hands of one's own comrades, who in their panic and greed forgot about camaraderie. Local residents also joined in this horrific scene, seeing the army flee and taking whatever they could carry. No one was safe in those terrible times. Even if you were wounded and lying on the field, your own people could finish you off to take your armor. Those who survived the battle often found themselves in an even more dangerous situation than during the fighting. They were hunted by looters looking for the wounded to rob and kill. If a soldier was taken prisoner, it did not necessarily mean that he would die. Often he could simply be released if he was a simple peasant or foot soldier. But if he was a knight or a lord, he would be held for ransom. It was an entire industry where everyone knew how much a person was worth. The value of a prisoner was determined by his status, the wealth of his family, and his importance to the state. A noble knight could be worth a huge fortune, amounting to tens or hundreds of pounds, while a baron could be worth entire villages and castles. This system was based on economic expediency. A living prisoner was worth incomparably more than a dead one. For example, after the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, King John II of France was captured by the English commander, the Black Prince, and a fabulous sum of 3 million gold écus was set for his ransom, which constituted a huge part of France's national budget. The codes and traditions of chivalry required prisoners to surrender with dignity and victors to treat them as valuable commodities. Capturing a noble prisoner was more profitable than killing him, as it could bring his captor enormous wealth. Moreover, the very fact of capturing a valuable prisoner could significantly enhance the status and reputation of a warrior. If a warrior captured a nobleman, he could become rich for life. Often, to keep a prisoner, he was put in a dungeon, and sometimes chained to the wall so that he could not escape. He could sit in a dungeon for years while his relatives gathered the necessary amount of money. During this time, the prisoner could fall ill or die of hunger if his captor did not want to feed him. If the captive had no money, his relatives had to collect the necessary amount. To do this, they could sell land, jewelry, or borrow money from moneylenders. Long negotiations took place, and the captive's fate depended entirely on their outcome. Otherwise, he could simply be sold into slavery or killed. This system worked like clockwork, and many aristocrats were interested in capturing another nobleman rather than killing him, as this promised huge profits. As you can imagine, ordinary soldiers were of no use to anyone as ransom, so they were simply killed on the battlefield to save time, or released if there was no point in keeping them. Their death on the battlefield was commonplace, while noblemen were seen as living capital that could be exchanged for wealth. For ordinary soldiers, captivity meant something completely different. At best, slavery. At worst, a quick execution. They could simply be killed to save time on guarding them. Sometimes they were taken into slavery, where they worked in the fields or on construction sites. They had no rights whatsoever. In the medieval army, there were no strict rules and codes that we are used to today. Discipline was maintained solely by the authority of the commander and the fear of punishment, which was inevitable and cruel. Everything depended on unwritten rules and the personal will of the military leader. Soldiers obeyed not a document, but the person who led them into battle. Each unit lived by its own laws, established by its leader, and this system was very flexible but extremely unpredictable for the average soldier. The absence of uniform rules meant that each commander established his own order, and this order was rarely lenient. His word was law, and his authority was unquestionable, since the life and death of every soldier depended on him. For example, a commander could order the immediate execution of a soldier for a minor offense if he believed it was necessary to maintain order. Any disobedience was seen as a direct attack on his power, So the punishments were so harsh that they served more to intimidate than to reform. Fear was the main tool for controlling a diverse army made up of mercenaries, peasants, and professional warriors. Soldiers often feared their commander more than the enemy on the battlefield because they knew that in battle they had a chance of survival. But in case of disobedience, they had no chance. Minor offenses, such as disobeying orders, drunkenness in camp, or fighting with a comrade, could be punished by public flogging. This was not only painful, but also deeply humiliating, as it took place in front of the entire army, turning into a show of force. Humiliation was a key element of flogging, and soldiers lost face and respect in the eyes of their comrades, which in a collective environment was worse than physical pain. The public nature of the punishment was an important part of this ritual. The commander turned flogging into a kind of spectacle to enhance its effect. Public flogging was part of the control system, as it not only punished the guilty, but also served as a powerful deterrent to others. Seeing one person punished, the others thought 10 times before breaking the rules. The commander could order a soldier to be tied to a post or a cart and flogged with belts or whips, sometimes to the point of death. It was a vivid and cruel lesson, demonstrating his absolute power and the inevitability of punishment for everyone else, as well as allowing the commander to strengthen his authority by showing that he would not tolerate disobedience. Each lash of the whip was a blow against disobedience, and the soldiers saw that their commander was serious in his intentions. The commander's authority was based not on respect but on fear, and this lesson was the most effective way of controlling people in the Middle Ages. The instigator of a rebellion could simply be chained to a pillory for several days to serve as a living example of what happens to those who dare to go against the commander's will. This was not just punishment, but ritualized humiliation designed to break the rebel's will and sow fear among his potential followers. For more serious crimes such as desertion, theft, or treason, a soldier faced immediate execution. These offenses were considered a direct threat to the existence of the entire unit, and therefore the punishment for them was the most severe. The commander could not afford to pardon or commute the sentence, and execution was inevitable. Moreover, executions were very cruel and inventive in order to enhance the deterrent effect and instill fear in all who witnessed them. The aim was not only to get rid of the criminal, but also to teach a lesson. The more brutal the execution, the greater the fear. For example, a soldier might be hanged from the nearest tree so that his body would hang there for a long time for all to see as a warning. It was a public act of intimidation so that everyone who passed by could see the consequences of disobedience. The body was left to rot to enhance the horror, and with each passing day it became an increasingly sinister reminder of the punishment. Sometimes deserters were hung on hooks to die slowly of suffocation, their screams serving as the soundtrack to this gruesome spectacle. A soldier could be burned at the stake as a heretic if his offense was related to blasphemy or sacrilege, or he could simply be beaten to death in front of the ranks with sticks or stones. All this took place in full view of everyone, so that other soldiers could see what awaited them if they disobeyed. This was a very effective way to keep people in fear and make them obey, because in such an army, fear was the only reliable way to maintain order. Without it, the army could simply collapse from internal conflicts and chaos. After the war ended, soldiers did not receive pensions or benefits. They simply returned to their peaceful lives, often without money or means of subsistence. Their service ended the moment they were no longer needed, and the state bore no responsibility for their future. Many of them simply had nowhere to return to, as they had lost their homes or families. The war had taken everything they had, and they returned to their native places to find only ruins. Those who had no home became vagrants, wandering the roads in search of any means of earning a living. Their lives were filled with suffering, hunger, and humiliation, as society treated them with suspicion and contempt, seeing them only as potential criminals and a burden. Society did not see them as heroes who had defended them, but as strangers who could be dangerous. No one helped them. There were no charitable organizations or government programs for them, and their problems were their own. They were often crippled, wounded in war, which made them even more helpless. They couldn't work, and their only hope was begging. At best, they could find work as a guard or servant for a lord, but this was rare. More often than not, they were forced to beg or commit petty theft to survive. Some of them formed gangs and terrorized the surrounding villages and towns. Their experience in war made them very dangerous bandits, and they used their skills to rob peaceful civilians. At worst, they died of starvation, disease, or at the hands of bandits who saw them as easy prey. Death was a common occurrence for former soldiers. They were vulnerable and often fell victim to others. This brutal reality was the final test for those who had survived the war. Their war did not end with the signing of peace, and they had to fight for their lives until the very end. We can see that serving in the medieval English army was far from a romantic adventure. It was a harsh reality filled with deprivation, fear, and cruelty. People went to war not for glory, but for survival, and they paid a very high price for it. Their lives were nothing more than pawns in a game of kings, and they had no right to choose what to do next. Their fate was sealed in advance. What do you think about this part of history? What people or times would you like to learn about in the next episode? Leave your opinion in the comments and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes.